Welcome back to Environmental Ethics. I'm Tom, and today we are discussing consequentialism. Consequentialism is an ethical theory that roughly claims that it is the consequences of our actions that determine their moral value. So, right or wrong is determined by consequences of our actions, if typically this is cashed out in terms of pleasure and pain. So, if your action produces more pleasure than pain, then it would be right. And if it produces more pain than pleasure, then it would be wrong. The specific version of consequentialism that we are going to be discussing is Utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill. For our purposes, we will use the terms utilitarianism and consequentialism interchangeably. They are different. There are different versions of consequentialism, but utilitarianism is kind of the most popular kind of consequentialism. It's kind of like Kleenex and tissues, or Q-tips and cotton swabs, right? It's one particular brand that has kind of taken up the market share, so to speak. And Mill's overarching principle is called the greatest happiness principle. And his greatest happiness principle states that acts are right in that they tend to promote happiness, and wrong in that they tend to promote the opposite. As stated, it looks like what Mill is suggesting is a kind of hedonism. Now, hedonism in kind of pop culture or in general discussions is the idea of a kind of pleasure-centered lifestyle. And usually this is cast as a kind of very individualistic pursuit of instant gratification, right? If it feels good, do it, right? And so what Mill's greatest happiness principle says is that if your act tends to promote happiness, then it's right. And so it looks like you should just do whatever makes you feel good. That's not true, as you probably know from doing the reading. So there are a couple important ways in which Mill separates himself from this individualistic kind of hedonism. In a kind of general way, Mill could be thought of as promoting a hedonistic philosophy, in the sense that Mill does agree that pleasure is the highest good. Happiness is the highest good. And this is a common theme in ethical theory, to look at what happiness is and see the pursuit of happiness as kind of the ultimate goal of being a human. However, that kind of individualistic hedonism we were just discussing is something that Mill rejects. And really there are two main ways to see him reject that. The first one is his distinction between higher and lower pleasures. Lower pleasures are the kind of base, individualistic, immediate pleasures that we think of as lower pleasures. So pleasures that you get from food and sex and drinking and drugs and those kinds of things. The higher pleasures are ones that are, for Mill, distinctive of rational beings. So think the pleasures you get from using your ability to reason, the pleasure you get from reading a book, or for studying, or from learning something new, or even perhaps watching a documentary, or doing art, or any of that kind of thing. Those are higher pleasures. And what Mill says is that the higher pleasures weigh more, right, are worth more than the lower pleasures. So we should value the higher pleasures more, and this kind of separates us from pursuing only lower pleasures all the time. The second main way in which he is not endorsing this kind of individualistic hedonism is that his happiness principle is the greatest happiness principle. And how is it the greatest happiness principle? Well, it advocates for the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Right? Mill is an advocate of the greater good. And so based on this, it's not just my happiness when he talks about the happiness principle. It's everyone's happiness. So when he says acts are right insofar as they tend to promote happiness, he's talking about everyone's happiness. So how do my actions impact the happiness of other people? On that scale, it looks like maybe whereas we might think getting drunk would make me happy right now, it might impact the people around me negatively, right? Or eating a bunch of food or whatever it is, right? Lower pleasures might impact other people negatively. Higher pleasures tend to not, but not always, right? But in any case, the way in which we're gauging the moral worth of our action has to do with whether or not it is promoting the greater good, right? The greater good for everyone involved. And so based on this, there's a couple things to say about this. One is that the way in which we kind of determine whether or not an action is good or bad is by using something like a utilitarian calculus. And there's a handout on this in this module. And it shows how we would kind of list all the people that are going to be impacted by a particular action. We kind of gauge where their happiness levels are. And then we think about the action and how it would impact everyone's happiness. And then we kind of tally up the results. We see how much the overall happiness is kind of impacted. Does it go up or does it go down? And so the example I give is kind of a classic example of stealing a loaf of bread in order to feed a couple of starving children. And of course, these children have very, very low amount of happiness, and the person that you're stealing, the baker you're stealing the loaf of bread from, has relatively high happiness, and the impact to the baker is pretty minimal, but the positive impact to the kids that are getting the stolen bread because they are starving is relatively high, right? And so it looks like the pain factor is pretty minimal and the pleasure factor is pretty high, and so all things considered, it promotes the greater good, right? And so when it comes to gray areas, doing something like utilitarian calculus is how we kind of gauge how the overall happiness is impacted. The other thing to think about with this is that there are concerns that promoting the greater good can kind of lose the individual or force or call upon us to engage in actions that we might think are unethical. So, for example, utilitarianism is the kind of paradigm that justifies things like war, for example, right? The idea is that, you engage in military action and you might lose some lives in that, but it would be for the greater good, right? It would promote the happiness of all the people in a country rather than just the few lives that are lost. But we might think that sometimes it's not worth it to sacrifice the few for the good of the many. But utilitarianism and consequentialism almost always mandate that, right? So if it boils down to sacrificing a few people, say 3 or 4, in order to promote the existence or the happiness of 100 people, then it seems like we're always morally obligated to do that, right? So, and sometimes we think that we shouldn't sacrifice a few for the good of the many, and sometimes we think that we should tend closely to our particular individual interests and ambitions and not always be concerned with the greater good. So this is some of the sticking point with utilitarianism and consequentialism. Nonetheless, it is a very intuitive ethical theory. Many of us tend to look to the future and think about the impact that our actions will have on the happiness of ourselves and other people around us. And so in that way, it really captures a really significant ethical intuition and ethical sensibility that I think is very natural for us to have. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching.